Hello, and welcome to episode 8. In this video, I will be building the Citadel Miniatures Tau Stormsurge model for use in Warhammer 40,000 by Games Workshop. If you're familiar with the model, you'll no doubt notice right away that I'm not using the supplied oval base. Instead, I'm using a 130mm round base with a 3D printed edition. I'm using an Elegoo Saturn to print my models and scenic base STL files. I had to split this round base to fit it onto my build plate, and luckily I was able to do so on a seam in the model. Nothing is perfect in 3D printing, and I have to do a little sanding to adjust the fit of the halves. I'm using a 150 grit nail file that you can find on any online site that offers cheap beauty products. As a side note, I am still very new to creating content. I decided to narrate and subtitle this video to see how viewers responded to the format versus only narrated or only subtitled. Back to modeling, the fit is looking better, but the piece is warped a bit from removing the base half from the build plate. I roughened the surfaces that will be bonded with superglue. This will give them a bit more tooth for the glue to bond to. And while I have the plastic portion of the base free, I will lightly sand the rim to help my primer adhere. I've recently purchased this JB Weld brand glue, and the gel consistency allows me to tack pieces together and gives me a little bit of a grace period of time before it cures. This way I can wiggle and finally adjust the pieces to line up before it dries and can no longer be manipulated. I mentioned that the printed model was warped, so I am using a clamp to hold the piece flat while the glue dries. Now that it's had time to set, I could start fitting the other half and take the clamps off to reuse on that side. You can see that I'm swirling the base a bit here, and that is to spread the glue out a little and flatten it so there are no high spots. Then, once I'm happy with the position of the scenic piece, I can set the whole assembly aside to dry. I'm happy with the way it bonded, and there doesn't seem to be any big noticeable gaps to fill like on some other projects. Now I can prime the resin and plastic base using my favorite Steinheil Res black primer. I always test my airbrush on my hand before I start on the model. Often, I leave a bit of cleaner in the airbrush between sessions, and this was evident here as I sprayed a bit out before the primer started. I will change the direction I am applying any primer or paint to make sure I get coverage into all the crevices like I am doing here. Having this turntable makes rotating the subject around easy, and this one came with a portable airbrush booth I bought from one of the big well-known auction sites. I use Testor's Aztec airbrush paints a lot. This is black from their opaque line. They tend to spray and cover very nicely. I paint all of my base rims in this style. It makes them all uniform and also finishes the otherwise bland plastic base rim. I'll want to protect the now dried rim with masking tape to shield it from any further airbrushing I do to the base. This is similar to Tamiya tape, but is an unbranded variety that performs as well. It is elastic enough to conform to mild curves and bends. Here is the same type of tape, but I switched to a thicker width. This will cover more surface than multiple passes of the thinner type I was using. I find if you stretch the tape slightly, it helps it adhere to the surface. I don't know why this happens, maybe some tape expert can chime in with an explanation? I use a decanted and thinned corn red base paint from Citadel to lay down a foundation for my scenic piece. I am blowing off dust and sanding particles here with just air before I start to commit with paint. By keeping a very shallow angle, I can preserve the natural shadows of the printed piece. The paint won't land in those seams, which will add depth and more visual interest. I don't want a totally uniform finish, so I am not being too careful about my application. Ultimately, I am going for a weathered hull or deck for the Stormsurge model to be placed on. All of my based 40K models share this theme. I'll be adding some corrosion and weathering to the surface using a few different paints, starting with this Steinal Res red-brown primer. This is a grey Scotch-Brite scuffing pad that I cut a small strip from to use as a way to dab random patterns of paint with. By varying the direction and pressure, I can deposit more natural looking scuffs and wear to the surface. I'll be using Coelia Green Shade in the same manner to add some darker tones to contrast the brighter simulated rust. Mixing some Vallejo base gray and natural steel will let me simulate some freshly exposed metal. This is an old, cheap makeup brush which makes a great dry brushing tool for soft applications. I'm adding fairly straight directional streaks to imply that something scraped away the surface of this deck. Or maybe something deposited grime as it was flying by? I'll leave it up to the viewers to decide. Tau makes this chrome pen, which I'm using to brighten the edges of some of the simulated chipping. To me, a brown panel liner comes in handy for adding a bit of grime to any model. It has a way of weeping into areas and ends up looking like an oil or fluid spill, especially on a surface like this one. Now that everything is dry, it's time to start playing with the additions to the base. I 3D printed some crates and items to place around the feet. I want the items placed away that implies that the cargo has been knocked around slightly by the model. Part of the challenge with using a 130mm round base is placing the feet far enough apart to create a suitable stance. I'll start assembling these components, which I had begun to build a few years ago. They had been glued together, but they still need a bit more fine-tuning to hide the bigger seams and joins. I find this Tamiya extra thin plastic cement to be great for gluing up the pieces. You can use it for regular bonding and running into seams to squish gaps together. Here I'm using it to smooth out some sanding marks. It melts the plastic and creates a glossy, finished look when it's cured. Now I can set aside these assemblies to dry and get to work on some of the next steps. This is a custom color I mixed up using my Steinel Res primers and some acrylic ink. It is supposed to match the old Citadel color Space Wolves Grey, which is now the name of a contrast paint. I'm priming the model assemblies in this light bluish gray to act as a base coat for my eventual white highlight. Tau models tend to be cleaner than more organic looking armies such as Tyranids. That being said, I still want to weather the model a bit too. I apply a few light coats before trying to build up the color. It is easy to bury the details with too many coats of paint, and I want those to remain crisp to add panel liner at a later step. I had started this model previous to deciding to make a video series out of my progress, and so I'm coating everything again to make a uniform finish. The first customization I will do is to fill some of these serrated panel lines to make the surface a bit less busy. I'm using Vallejo plastic putty, but you can use whatever you prefer. I've primed these structural leg pieces already with Steinal Res Black. I want to add some highlights to the pieces using the zenithal technique. For that, I'll be using this Vallejo Model Air base gray color. I'm testing my paint spray pattern on my hand like usual to make sure it's performing before I start on the model. And then I am positioning the assembly so that the highlight lands where light would be hitting it most when it's upright. I'm dusting on a very light coat to control how pronounced the highlight is compared to the shadowed areas. If you apply too much or in the wrong direction, you can always just go back and prime the piece again, no big deal. It's more important to enjoy your hobby rather than trying to achieve perfect results every time. I make mistakes quite often, you just don't see them because it would make the video way too long. These clips came with a cheap paint stand I bought online. You could also make your own using electrical alligator clips bought in bulk and cheap bamboo skewers for the rod. They come in really handy for projects that have many small parts to keep organized and hold while painting. And here is the piece after zenithal airbrushing and assembly. I feel it needs a bit more highlighting, so I'll be using Steinel Res Gray Primer to gently bring out those edges. You are likely familiar with dry brushing, but just in case you aren't, I am removing a lot of the wet paint from the brush on a paper towel. Then, I can apply some faint and subtle color to the edges without being sloppy with a ton of wet paint on the brush. It takes very little paint and very little pressure to make a big difference. This is where a thin, smooth base coat can really be rewarding. There is very little rough texture to catch the bristles and makes a finer result. If you find you've applied too much dry brush highlights, you can add a wash like Citadel Nuln Oil to darken the highlight. Now I'll add a white highlight to my parts that I want to read as armored. This is Tamiya X2 White, which I have decanted and thinned for airbrushing. Decanted is just a fancy word for rebottled. I find it easier and neater to dispense from a dropper nozzle than the Tamiya jars. Here I'm misting on a light coat of white to highlight the upper areas of the feet. The lower portion will remain that light gray-blue color I used my primer to coat. There is a very subtle blend from white to light blue-gray. Again here, I'm airbrushing from an upward direction on the model to have the white paint land where the light would fall. I'm making very light passes over the areas I want to be faded from white to the base color. You can see how powdery the effect is on my glove. It is a very simple technique that anyone can do, so I hope you will try it and see for yourself. Here I'm adding a bit more highlight to boost the white, as after it dried I thought it could be a little brighter. You can see the white paint slowly accumulating on the surface here, and I'm using the edge of the surface to mask the panel from having too much paint land on the adjacent area. By keeping the airbrush angle very shallow, I can control how the paint sprays onto the surface. I used the flexible masking tape again to mask off areas I want to paint using this ochre color. I mixed this up from red, brown, and yellow primers. I tinted one batch a bit darker to act as a base coat that I can later highlight with the more pale tint. If you're familiar with the Tau Empire, you might have seen a similar color used on some of the models that Games Workshop publishes online. Now switching to the pale version, I can highlight this armor panel like I did with the previous one in white. It can be hard to see the effect when the paint is still wet, so I go back to my glove frequently for reference. I'm after a subtle change here. There is already a lot of contrast between the structural pieces of the model and the armor. And that's alright. Nothing is perfect and I can laugh at myself a bit. And now some decal fun. I'm using some Mr. products to help adhere and soften these very old decals. These could be almost 20 years old by now, but they still work fine. I've got larger than average hands, so these can be tricky to position. Please bear with me as I try to apply these and keep a decent camera angle. I'm applying these white decals over the light armor color to make some really subtle points of interest for anyone who happens to look closely. You can see the effect the decal softener has on the film as it gently wraps around that hard edge. These products aren't mandatory to have, but they help. Tamiya Gray Panel Liner is one of my favorite products to use on any of my models, from historical scale models to sci-fi tabletop minis. I'm also using their X20 thinner to help the panel liner flow into the gaps and corners. I'm using gray for this project as it's just right for the white paint. Black or brown would be too strong a contrast for my tastes. I tend to start with the finer details, and as I lose patience, I become more liberal with my application. I want to add some wear to these otherwise tidy crates, so I will be duplicating the process I used to weather the base. It's very easy to get carried away with weathering. I've read many times that by the time you start to ask yourself if it's enough, it's already too much. So I found that I add a little, put the piece down, and look at it to see where I can add more. The armor assemblies will get a little bit of wear too. I don't normally do this for Tau models, but I wanted to expand my style a bit. I'm trying to be very gentle with the application and stick to areas that make sense. I wanted to define that curved edge a bit more than the white highlight showed, so I used a bit of chipping to help illustrate the transition. Mulatto's liquid chrome pen comes in handy for fine, bright wear. Just be careful not to press too hard or it will apply too much. I'll use some more JB Weld superglue to affix the crates and feet to the base here. Its gel consistency allows for some positioning before drying. Dry fitting the pieces allows me to get an idea of where each component should go and where to place the glue. I have to consider the whole model and balance the composition of the scene when I'm placing everything. It takes some practice, but you can always refer to pictures of others' completed models to get an idea. Maybe these crates were stacked and aligned nicely before this model wandered into the scene and bumped them around? I'll be going back and painting the rear face of the armor panels to match the structural pieces. I'm test fitting them now before the glue dries. And here's a little bit more cargo scatter to liven up the scene. I'm using Citadel Castellan Green to base coat these canisters. I positioned them and glued them together to look as if they've been bumped and tumbled by an intruding giant mecha. Adding shading came next with this Army Painter Dark Tone wash. It is almost black and makes a good substitute for Citadel Nuln Oil. I hadn't used this wash before now, so I was pretty careful with my first application. Then as I became more comfortable, it showed. Next, I added some chipping and wear with Vallejo natural steel and a gray scuffing pad. Citadel Runefang steel brightened up the chipping in random areas to help create some more variety and contrast to the dull green base. And then some Steinel Res red-brown primer, which I diluted a lot with alcohol to make a thin, rusty-colored wash. I imagined these canisters leaking some form of corrosive gas that was rusting the shell of the container after being neglected so long. Adding alcohol to the primer helps it dry quickly, and I can build up thin layers to convey the film effect. I'm going to position these canisters slightly over the edge of the base to imply that they are in danger of tumbling away. And I'm very happy with that. Thank you for joining me and for watching this far. I'll be posting the next episode in this series shortly. Until next time.